All right, you guys, welcome back. This is a part 2. I'm still joined by Scott Shapiro and John Doyle from OptixEQ. We're going to pick up where we left off with Always Dreaming. And Always Dreaming is kind of an interesting horse because he came back at Tampa Bay, trained by Todd Pletcher for the first time, and really he's just kind of put it together. John, I know you did this race because you were covering Tampa like a lot of these winter tracks. An A-, best of the speed, closed gallop. Then he came over at Gulfstream, and for his last 2 races, perfect trip, 2 back in that optional claimer, but just did it the right way. Wasn't asked, had it his own way, but still looked good doing it. And I think that set him up very well for the Florida Derby, earning a B+. I guess the question with this horse is this a horse that's, he's lightly raced, only has those 5 starts and almost 3 the way that we're kind of looking at him. Is a horse that's going to take another move forward, just kind of finally putting it all together? Or, John, like you said, is he going to go back to those kind of grip minus when he doesn't have an open length lead in the stretch?
Yeah, that's my only concern is, when someone looks him in the eye in the stretch, is it going to be a problem? That was an impressive, Florida Derby, and it's one of the better, races, prep races. So, it's hard to ignore. And I don't know, physically, I don't know, for just some reason, and I'm not a horse expert in how horses look, but physically, he just doesn't look like, a 1.25 mile horse to me. It's kind of the length of his neck and stuff, but, that take that with a grain of salt. I do think he's the now horse, and, like when I first saw his first two races, basically, he couldn't get by horses, and, like you said, since the Pletcher thing, he's kind of a new horse. And he's been really impressive. So no knocks in his last 3 races, and he just could be the now horse. He just could be improving immensely. It's just going to be, can he look another eye and pass a horse in the stretch? Because I think he's going to have to do that. He's going to get more contention than he's gotten in these last few races in terms of a pace perspective.
Right, and we talked about the plot. The plot kind of will have to sort itself out, but a big square in quadrant 3, and again, we'll just kind of have to see where that all shakes out. But it is nice to know he's got some finishing ability and can be forwardly placed if needed. Scott, you and I were watching this race together in Vegas. Maybe I don't know if you've watched it since or have kind of gone back and done your homework. What do you think about this horse?
I've certainly watched the race since, and it's hard to knock the race specifically, anything about it. He got a great trip, but he got a great trip because of his tactical speed. I noticed that Velasquez got him off the rail as quick as possible, but maybe that, is not unique to this horse and just is the ideal way of getting right off the pace setter in that race, who I believe was State of Honor. But my concern with this horse is can he continue to move forward? It was kind of a big move from those 2 races, both at Tampa and then the optional claiming race on March 4th at Gulfstream. It was a big move forward for him in terms of performance ratings that I look at least. And will Pletcher be able to get back to that spot? I know a lot of his horses make their biggest move in their 3rd start, like many trainers. And it'll be interesting to see if he can get back to that race. I'm not concerned about the Pletcher narrative. I know he's capable of winning this race, but maybe this is a horse that ran his best race at Gulfstream and may regress. And like John said, I didn't really, not something I noted, but an additional knock could be, how's he going to perform when he gets looked in the eye? Is he going to be able to handle that and battle? I mean, he's pretty much overmatched all 3 of his competitors. In all 3 of his races, he's outmatched all of his competitors easily. So it'll be interesting to see, but the talent seems to be there.
Yeah, I saw, when you said he kind of got him out of the rail early, he did have a little bit of trouble going into the first turn, but I do agree. Velasquez did an awesome job just getting him out of that trouble and getting into a good spot. I think, John, you brought up that point of looking a horse in the eye, and you see that he's won by 12 lengths and 4 lengths and 5 lengths, and if there's a stretch duel, and I think that's an interesting point because that's just not something you're going to see when you look at his running lines. You have to go back and watch tape.
Yeah, and the other thing is just to note, sometimes, all the horses, ran a big race. There's reasons, like there's pace dynamics. So in his last 3 races, or actually the last 4 races, he's had an average early race shape, and slow. So he's been in races where there hasn't been much contention early. The one race where there was contention early, go back at his debut, and he kind of like faltered late. So I just think the early pace, let's see how, that quadrant one shakes out and, see where these horses, kind of fit above the par line. If that first, early pace is contentious and he's part of that might be his undoing. It may not be that he ran a big effort and, now he's going to regress. It could be just more the dynamics of the pace that kind of determine how well he runs. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I pulled that up and I'm showing that in grid right now, so people have a visual to what you're talking about as far as the race shapes, and that is a really good point, and this is such an awesome tool to have these race shapes here to be able to reference how the race was played out, and then how that rates to today's scenario. So that's an excellent tool, and something that in handicapping you should definitely be looking at.
Quick question, in terms of those, I can't see what you're looking at, Emily, and just looking at the Kentucky Derby standard plot. Mm-hmm. Was he in quadrant 3 in those races, and if he was not, is that a huge concern for you guys? I know it's not ideal by any stretch, but being that big square in quadrant 3 can be kind of confusing. I know I've spoken to you guys about this before, but I know that can confuse people. How do you guys see horses in that situation or that spot on the grid?
I think he was a square in quadrant 3 in his last race. I pulled it up right now in the Florida Derby. He's a square. He's primarily in quadrant 3, so he's a quadrant 3 horse, but a quarter of the square is in quadrant 1. But he did have a quadrant 3 square that day.
Yeah, Scott, I think that's a great question. Here's kind of my answer to it. It depends on if you think the race, if there's a lot of horses above the line and the race is going to be fast, and this horse just typically likes to be close to the pace. That's based on that he's kind of leftmost to the, even though he's in quadrant 3, if he's left, so he wants to be, his run style says I want to be up close, and. In a race where it's kind of paceless or not much pace, that's fine because, he's going to be able to be probably up close, and the big square indicates he's got good late pace, right? The concern is, and that's what you're seeing, like what I was trying to point out, is this race it may be a lot faster, in the early part of it, and so he's going to either have to use himself early, okay, which may affect his big square, his late pace, right? And that's the concern. So if you've got a horse that's typically likes to be up close in quadrant 3, it's not bad in races where there's not a lot of contention, a lot of horses above him in quadrant 1. However, but if there is, I'm concerning about the ability to keep up and have the same kind of late kick that he's been demonstrating in his races. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so that's my concern with him. Just so you know, I mean, if you go back, the race, the American Pharaoh he was in quadrant 3, but he was much closer to quadrant 1, and quadrant 1 wasn't that crowded in his Derby, but he was a huge square in quadrant 3, bordering quadrant 1. So, in that race, he kind of sat off, the two speeds, Dortmund and that Callahan horse, I don't
Firing Line.
And, he just outkicked him. It was tough, but he outkicked him. But, he had to use himself to keep up to those horses, and he did outkick him in the stretch. So, just be conscious of what the pace scenario is in that race. And sometimes they are horses that you want to kind of, especially as favorites, you might want to really look to bet against if the pace scenario is going to be, quick and hot and stuff like that, because they're going to have to use themselves to keep up.
Good stuff.
A horse that won't use himself to keep up early is the number 8 Gunnavera. And this is kind of a horse that, 2 back in the Fountain of Youth I was completely against and kind of got the right setup, and then stuck to my guns in the Florida Derby. And he just is kind of my this year's exaggerator, and taking that, probably going to take that opinion here. Again, the plot, because on the plot, I guess, he could get a favorable trip. He seems kind of like a Gulfstream horse. I might be a little biased. Scott, what do you think about Gunnavera?
Well, it's funny that you give that analogy to last year's Exaggerator because if you remember, I picked Exaggerator in the Derby. And I don't know if I'm going to pick Gunnevere to win this race. I think it might be too much to ask to run them all down. I think they'll likely be one or two better. But I think this is an excellent key horse this year underneath. And if you're playing trifectas and superfectas or even exactas, because I think that this horse is probably my favorite of the late runners. I don't hear a lot of buzz. Obviously, I love the fact that Castellano is riding this horse. And I just think he's been really consistent. I think he ran against the flow in that last race in the Florida Derby. The other three top finishers were the top three throughout the race. So while I would never have bet him at even money in that race, I wasn't so against the way he ran. And I think that the Fountain of Youth was extremely impressive. And I thought in the Holy Bull, he was up closer than he wanted to be. He had trouble. And what I really was encouraged by in that race is that when he had trouble and lost momentum, he still fought on. So I like that gameness. He kind of didn't quit. So my main concern on this horse is that I always struggle with expecting horses that run a Gulfstream to translate that form to other tracks. And the barn's lack of experience in a big race like this is always a concern to me, mainly in the Kentucky Derby where the atmosphere is so chaotic. But I like what I've seen from this horse more than you, and if he can be last year's Exaggerator and finish second, it could be a good day for me.
John, what do you think on Gunnevere?
I don't knock anyone that kind of likes the horse. My problem is he's a deep closer, and I'm kind of more aligned with what you said, Emily. I just think he's like, if you go back and look at that Fountain of Youth and the Holy Bull, those races were kind of soft in the middle in terms of fractions, and he was able to get back into the race. And, the difference between that and the Florida Derby, it was soft early, but it started picking up. And so that was like Scott said, it was against the flow. But I think the flow of the Derby is going to be more like, average to fast early. And I'm concerned he gets just too far behind and, making up all that ground. Unless they're kind of falling apart, that's always difficult. You got to navigate through all that traffic. He's one of those horses I think we'll be talking about, like on Sunday, about being a trip horse.
Yeah.
He got in trouble. He got this. Oh, he's going to be good for the next thing. That's my concern with him. Just when you're betting these horses, and I agree with Scott, I wouldn't be kind of, keying him on the front, maybe in underneath. But it'd be hard for me to kind of like, have a lot of confidence in him in the win, and just because of his run style.
Yeah, and I did note the last time out is the only time this horse was warm and slog. So I think that's kind of interesting too, because there's no mention of that. I know he's a closer, but there's no slog in the notes anywhere except for last time, along with warm, which is probably, like we were mentioning with Classic Empire, maybe something you want to look at from when you're looking at the horse on the track. What's his kind of attitude and appearance going into the race?
And there's one other thing too. If he has to run at some point to catch up to the field, now he's going to have another quarter of a mile, right? So you kind of showed that a little bit in the Florida Derby, longer distance. And I just think, that's kind of my only concern is that, he kind of got to use to get to the field, and then he's got to go on with that afterwards. He's another quarter of a mile to go. But, and the other thing, it's a minor thing, but it's something I always note is, he's kind of declining in our figures the last three races. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's sort of what I was saying with you're putting the number sort of to that note, right, of where he was kind of given that appearance of maybe he's kind of raced his races, right? And it will be interesting. He does have 35 days, which is better than the 228s he had prior in Florida, but we'll have to ship. He's interesting. Again, I feel like Exaggerator, and that's what gives me anxiety because he beat us, John. I remember you and I afterwards were like, after the Preakness, like, all right, Exaggerator's a pretty good horse. He just has that sort of one-turn feel, and the more that you described him, that's kind of the way I see it. I'm going to have to really think about that guy. The number 9, Practical Joke. Again, seems to be kind of moving forward just a little bit, but does he have some hang in him? That's kind of what I've seen the last couple times. He looked like he was in a position where he had it and then seemed to just kind of flatten out. Not quite a grit minus, but you do have to question. Only B pluses came back as a 2-year-old, and then been BBB in those last 3 races. Just kind of seems a cut below some of the others. Just doesn't really have that wow factor. John, I know you were watching Keeneland. We talked a little bit about this race. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, he was wide, and he did try to move into that fast middle fraction, and I think that's what flattened him out. You remember, if you looked at the race on the turn, McCracken couldn't even keep up.
Yes.
And he was moving into that, and he ran okay. Like, but your point is, like, in a couple races he has, and I think the Breeders' Cup was another one where they really separated from him. Like Classic Empire really separated from him late. But he's the kind of horse, like, he ran that 97 in the Champagne, which is a good 2-year-old number, right? And if you kind of project improvement, maybe he can run in the 104, 105 range, which could win this race. This is his 3rd race, so he's kind of like coming 3rd race in his current form cycle. So maybe there's upside on this horse. I just don't know when I just kind of compare him to like Classical Empire and some others in here who kind of really separated from him in that Breeders' Cup. But that was 2-year-old, so I don't know with him. The mile in the court, I guess, is the question mark. But you could do worse for trainers, right? I mean, so I think he's going to be ready for a good performance. Don't know if it's going to be good enough to win, but I would consider him.
Yeah, there are things to like, and I that's why I love the grading system, because it goes back and it shows that this is a horse that has some class. In order to get 2 B pluses in a grade 1, even though they're 2-year-olds, that's showing that this horse has the class. And then B's aren't bad. B is a winning race, so we want to see kind of that B plus going forward. Scott, I know we talked about this horse in the Fountain of Youth, and liked him a little bit that day, even though it was coming off the layoff. What are your impressions? Do you like that 3rd race of the form cycle?
I generally almost always like that. I like this horse. I think in the end he might be the most talented horse in the field. I liked him in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, where John mentioned, and was kind of disappointed with the way he finished that race. I think, and it's intriguing, with your guys' way, your visual impressions of the horses being able to get the distance, but to me he has the look of a horse that is going to thrive at Belmont's 1 turn, whether it be this year or next year. I think he's super talented. I did see, the somewhat tough trip in the Bluegrass where he was wide and whatnot. But to me, if that was the only time he kind of had that situation occur where he hung late, or whatever term you want to use, I would take it more for face value. But I've seen this happen before, especially the Fountain of Youth. Yes, it was off the layoff, but it just seems like this horse is going to be better at shorter distances. I don't know. I think he's going to take some money because of Chad Brown and because of the consistent numbers that he's run, and because of the wide trip in a race that has come back in many people's view as the best in terms of performance in the preps right before the Derby. So I can't endorse this horse on top, and I'm probably going to avoid using him because of my concerns about the 1.25 miles.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where he comes out once we have the final plot. Currently, a circle in quadrant 2.
Yeah. Which is negative. I mean, which is negative.
I was gonna allude to that, but yeah, and you can't really. I know we're gonna see some like shuffling around, but some of those things you just that seems about right in my opinion.
Yeah. That's a great point, Scott. I think you're right on with him being maybe a one turn horse. That's probably right. So some of those Belmont races, as he kind of improves, maybe even so there's so many of those. Everything's 1 turn at Belmont, right? Mile 8 is 1 turn. There's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah.
So.
We'll talk about J-Boy's Echo, and I know, John, you've talked and kind of upgraded this Bluegrass a little bit with the number 10 J-Boy's Echo. I gave this horse a C+, went back and watched it, and like a lot of horses at Keeneland, early on he was sort of jumping shadows on the backstretch, which it's something I see at Keeneland a lot, and so I don't really, I noted it in the notes, but I don't see him probably doing that at Churchill. The one thing about this horse, he just seems a little bit too slow. I watched him work in the morning the other day, and he just didn't wow me. In fact, I think I gave him sourpuss. He kind of had his ears pinned the whole time. So I'm not really a fan of this horse. Am I missing something? I know you watched his races over at Aqueduct.
No, I don't think so. He got a perfect trip in the Gotham. And the only thing I'd say is that he kind of like his numbers kind of gradually going up, and it's Dale Romans, and it just seems like, he hits the board in the Derby with horses you never expect. But I can't, I agree with you 100%. There's nothing I could say here that would make me kind of love this horse, but the Dale Romans factor, it just seems like he really points to and has horses overachieve in the Derby. That's all.
And that's why when I watch that work, and I'll continue to watch, and I like watching gallops almost as much because you can just see the characters of the horses. I would want to just see a little bit more positive, but it's, super good point. Scott, you think a little bit too slow?
Yeah, I think too slow. It'll be interesting to see who he legs up with Robbie Alvarado getting hurt. I know there's been a few options that he's discussed, and I know he was disappointed. I mean, he does have his horses run well in the Derby, but he also is very likes to tout his horses quite a bit. I heard him say earlier this morning or yesterday, don't leave this horse out in your exotics and whatnot. So I guess there's been more surprising horses that have hit the back end of the trifecta or superfecta. It's I think he'll need everything to go right to even do that.
Okay. Let's move on to the number 11, State of Honor. A horse that's just been picking up checks underneath, working his way into this field behind some of the other horses. Is there anything about this horse that you could see him kind of turning the tables on some of these other horses, namely stablemate? John, you want to start with this guy?
I kind of defer to you guys a little bit on this. I mean, I did see this horse in the Sam Davis and the Tampa Bay, and I just think even though he ran okay, he wasn't as good as the two horses coming out of McCracken and what was the other? Tapwrit. Yeah. So I mean, I just don't see. To your point, I don't see that. I don't see this horse turning the table, especially with kind of what the anticipated race shape probably looks like in the Derby.
Yeah, I agree. Just seems a little bit below, even though he's honest and does have a big foundation underneath him. Scott, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing positive I would say is he's been very consistent, which is a nice thing to see. And if somehow the race shape, once these other horses, all the defections take place, or the horses that don't have enough points don't get in, and, looking at the plot, if you see that, it kind of decongest, if you will. It's just so congested up there. It seems like it's going to be hard for a horse like this to even hang around. But, maybe underneath in the exotics, if somehow a lot of the other EP types defect from the race. But other than that, I think it's a reach and a horse that's out on the outside looking in.
Yeah, I agree. We mentioned it as we were talking about State of Honor, the number 12 Tapwrit going back to winning the Tampa Bay Derby, B+ effort. Visually was impressive. He had that traffic burst. And then noted the gallop minus, and I know, John, this was you taking over at Tampa. This is something that I've seen with Todd Pletcher horses at Gulfstream in the past, where they after the race, it's almost like by instruction, they pull him up. I thought his race in the Bluegrass, I thought that was kind of a sneaky trip. Just kind of had a hard time finding position in there, and just was never comfortable. And I gave him an improve out of that because I just thought things just didn't work out. It was almost one of those races that you don't really draw a line through, because it wasn't like he had major trouble, although he did have some traffic. It just looked like a race that you're like, this horse is better than that. So he's got some races going back that definitely figure and might get overlooked off that Bluegrass effort.
Yeah, I think it could be. I just think he's got to improve a lot. Off of that, and his numbers are going on the wrong way. And he said, I was surprised they came right back with the Bluegrass. Running that horse in the Bluegrass after the Tampa Bay Derby. I guess they wanted to get some more into him. I liked his Sam Davis. That's the race I did like, and I thought he kind of ran good in the Tampa Bay Derby. But like I said, you know more about the Pletcher horses. I just did not like the gallop out, and yeah, I definitely see the horse improving. Is it enough to win? Is the big question.
Yeah, of course. Scott, what do you think about Tapwrit?
Well, the one thing I would say is it is weird that odd that they ran him in the Bluegrass, but at the same point, they didn't need points. They didn't need him to do anything. I remember being completely against them that day. So maybe he can rebound and run back to the races at Tampa. Not my favorite of the late running types. Where does he? I'm looking at the plot. I guess he's in a okay spot, right? But doesn't look like he has as big of a kick as some of the others that are in that quadrant 4 spot. I wouldn't be surprised if this horse ran much better than what we saw in the Bluegrass. I'm kind of torn right now, to be honest. I need to see more as the week progresses. Do we know who's riding this horse as of now, or is it Jose Ortiz again? Yeah, it looks like
the way that it's listed here, it is, yes.
Okay, it says no rider on what I'm looking at. Okay.
Yeah, on the grid that I have. Yes.
What did you guys think of his ability to continue to get the distances? Was that a concern? I know that his best races are at a mile and a 16th and a mile.
There wasn't anything other than, if you thought John on the Gallop minus, which, you thought it was abbreviated, but did you think he was pulling himself up? He did have the race pretty much secured by a 4.5 length lead, which makes me think that it's one of those times, and the way that it looked visually, that they were instructed to not do too much after the wire, more than it being like he just didn't want to go that much further.
Yeah, well, he made a swooping move in that race, so he burst, and I just, maybe I was thinking maybe he got a little winded, and that's why they abbreviated. I don't know, it's hard to read on this. I think maybe he's more of a kind of like he's a kind of a one move horse, but and I think you got to be more of a kind of a 2 move horse to kind of factor in the Derby, but who knows? Things could maybe set up for him. You just like a mile and 8, even a mile and 16 is so much different than a mile and a quarter race. It's like completely different. And he just doesn't strike me like, oh, he's definitely a mile and a quarter horse, right? It just doesn't strike me like that. But who knows until they do it? You really don't. So.
Yeah, and that might have been the reason why they ran him at the 9, is they just wanted to see, as far as kind of the same thing. Like, we're just not sure. What if we run him at 9 and see what he does, just to kind of get a better idea, and then just kind of trip. You never really got to see it. So yeah, I'm totally with you 100% on that. I'm not either way. It's definitely still a question mark on Tapwrit. As far as the plot goes, he will be kind of an interesting horse to see where he does, because he's listed as the number 12 and 50-50 between quadrant 2 and quadrant 4, and then I use that scale on the grid to find out where he is, and he's a quadrant 4 according to the grid, but it'll be interesting to see if maybe he moves to quadrant 2. John, would you kind of upgrade him a little bit, do you think? Just kind of going off other plots if he's a square in quadrant 2 versus 4?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, if you're not in quadrant 1, I'd be looking for squares that have some, substance to them. Okay. Because again, you're going to need to really kick on, and you've seen it in some of the races where you notice in some of these races how horses separate. That just tells you a lot about the difference. In terms of ability to go farther and to finish, and I think that's he's going to have to. He hasn't done that to me. I mean, he kind of burst in the Tampa Bay race, but I don't know about a sustained move yet. The horses, there's a few horses, and we'll get into when the plot kind of shakes out, that really have a good sustained move, and those horses are usually the horses that could kind of win the Derby.
Right. Yeah, he's, the more that I just look at it, it's like, we have a lot of horses that we've talked about so far in these first two videos, it's kind of like they've had a perfect trip, and this horse has never really. So it is kind of interesting. That's part of why we're still sort of feeling him out. There is only 6 starts. One of them you can almost draw a line through, being that debut at Saratoga. We're gonna do one more video. Malagasy, I think, is the pronunciation we're gonna go with, is out. So the last video will pick up at number 14 hints and go all the way through to a couple of the AEs. Anything you guys want to add before I shut down this part 2 video?
Nope.
No, I think it's interesting so far that none of us seem to be totally all in on any one horse like John was with American Pharaoh 2 years ago or something of that nature. So it kind of shows just how wide open this race is, and it'll be interesting to see how even the post positions shake out to see how that affects the pace and flow of the race, and see who decides to defect if that happens, and who will move in from the AE list. So should be fun to handicap this race leading up to it.
Cool. All right. I think that's a good point. We'll talk about that more. All right, you guys, thanks again for watching. Part 3 coming up.